And Representative King was very gracious with his time with me, telling me in unvarnished terms what the successes and failures of the process that he underwent were, as far as he was concerned, not only in terms of potential opponents, but things that he felt he did right, things that he felt he did wrong and would change. And it was invaluable to me to hear the experience of another, and in fact, the debate played out in Indiana almost to the letter of what Representative King had gone through in Texas. And so with that in mind, I come to my friends in Ohio and say, here's what to expect, here's what I challenge you to do, have fun. I got a bill draft back right after Christmas, which meant I was discussing amendments and changes all through the Christmas holiday, which is the other thing I'm still apologizing to my wife before. She brought that up about a week ago. But what we introduced, I felt I owed it to the community to have a discussion with them. And I set up a series of briefings, not only for those that I felt would support the bill, but those who I was pretty certain were going to oppose it. And I laid out the principles, and I said to them, everything's on the table for discussion, but it's for discussion with me. There will be no backroom deals. There will be nothing cut among the industry players. It will all be in the light of day. And, of course, there was immediate opposition. It was a sweeping bill that included everything from eliminating utilities regulatory jurisdiction over advanced services, allowing for rate increases on basic local service in return for demonstrated investment in broadband build-out. In essence, you were freed from basic rate regulation if you place broadband DSL quality service in each central office in which you sought to do a rate change. A basic telco service deregulation, a requirement that wholesale jurisdiction would not exceed federal law, a biennial review by the Utilities Regulatory Commission of rules that are no longer in the public interest or necessary to protect consumers, specific removal of commission jurisdiction over communication service rates, depreciation schedules, service quality, other than reporting, because we have a standing Regulatory Flexibility Committee which seeks to evaluate public utilities in the state of Indiana, electric and telco. And we felt that it was important for us to have some reporting requirements to evaluate the success or failure of the legislation. Some of those reporting requirements were rather vigorously opposed by the wireless industry, and I still tell them they were simply wrong about it. So we've agreed to disagree on that. We put in some provisions for telecommunications providers of last resort. We required certificates of territorial authority for all communications service providers. We took the video franchise process to the state level, which was arguably one of the most contentious portions of the legislation, both in terms of the municipalities, which was really interesting discussion because in practical fact, the ability of municipalities to have any meaningful impact on service quality, rates, or anything else with respect to the provision of cable service was negligible. We found that there were some PEG channel requirements that could be negotiated, some public drops that were negotiated, but those were only in the very largest of cities. And for most of the mid to smaller markets in the state of Indiana, it got to the point where we asked some of the municipalities for a copy of their cable franchise agreement, and they couldn't find them. If they had one, they didn't know where it was. It obviously hadn't been reviewed or updated in years, and it was certainly not being enforced to any meaningful degree because there was no effective competition. There was one game in town. Franchise fees became obviously a very key point of discussion as well. We eliminated any sort of build-out requirement. And, the whole concept of redlining and whether there was going to be cherry picking of neighborhoods We received some very good data from the Phoenix Institute with respect to their study on whether redlining was occurring, and sufficient to allay most of the concerns that were raised. But one of the things that I think was most telling, the point of this legislation was to spur investment, to encourage businesses who have limited investment dollars, many of them in multiple states, to view us as the most attractive destination for that investment. And so the typical thought among those who opposed the legislation was to view this as an AT&T bill or a Verizon bill and only think about those Fortune 500 players. But one of the things Phil King and I had discussed at some length was what the lack of a build-out requirement did to encourage small telecommunications providers to make an investment. They might not have the ability to put together the financing to do a major city overbuild, but they could, excuse me, they could put together enough money to go into a smaller service area to dip a big toe in the water. One of my providers said that they only service part of a city with voice service, and they wanted the ability to overbuild that area without having to overbuild areas that they did not currently have the territorial authority for as a local exchange provider. These were things that weren't on the face of the discussion evident, but as you delved into it, it did make a great deal of sense. If you're a small family-owned telephone company, not sure what the future was going to be, certainly afraid of your ability to compete with a 900-pound gorilla of an AT&T, as well as the concern of what technology was going to do. I know at the time I was told WiMAX was nothing more than a pipe dream that would never amount to anything. Obviously, we see that changing very quickly. But if you were a small company looking to put out a 30-year bond to put fiber in the ground and had the fear that 5 or 10 years down the road you might be leapfrogged by technological advances, at least the deregulation allowed you to choose your own pace of investment. Actually, that was one of the other provisions that was eventually negotiated out of the bill. I put in a prohibition of municipal internet service, and that was kind of like throwing a match on a pile of oily rags. It went up in flames in a very big hurry, but it did spur quite an aggressive discussion. And there were so many small communities who are struggling in the changing economy and were grasping at something to give themselves a competitive advantage and thinking that this might be the thing that would leverage opportunities for job creation. And yet I pointed out to them that the traditional public finance model of a 30-year bond was likely to find them on the hook for a significant infrastructure investment where they had no revenue model to support it. And I went to community after community and said, okay, here's your plan. Let me see your income projections. Well, we don't have that yet. Okay, well, how much are you going to charge? Well, we don't know. Are you going to provide video services? Well, we think we might. I said, okay, is the city council going to decide whether you offer the Playboy channel or not? We hadn't thought of that before.